Hello, friends. You probably also often hear people trying to draw parallels between Ukraine and Israel, most often, of course, one-sidedly in those aspects that are beneficial to a particular speaker. Let me show you a clip from General Krivonos' speech right away.
We must recognize we're in a situation like the one Israel once faced. Every citizen of Ukraine must work clearly for our victory at all times, and all of this will depend on whether each citizen is able to defend their own country with a weapon in their hands. And everything needs to start, from kindergartens. That was absolutely the right thing to do. The question isn't about being 18, 24, 60, or 55. Both you and she need the skills. It applies to women too, who must also know how. A military occupational specialty in multiple fields will greatly boost our mobilization potential. Mandatory training of children in drone operation and the basics of topography as part of the geography subject. Every school had several bags of lead pellets. A few simple air rifles and tactical goggles, because for us, unfortunately, in some cases it's more about stomachs. No one will go to the enlistment office. Honestly, I don't owe anyone anything.
Disclaimer, this isn't criticism of the military. General Krivonos was discussing politics, not war. And it doesn't matter who said it, I just want to dispel these myths and explain to you how things really are and why everything that General Krivonos mentioned is simply impossible in Ukraine. And it's not even necessary, and you'll also find out what is necessary. So everyone has to fight, everyone to the front, tell everything to children in kindergarten, show them everything, war is forever, we got that. Let's just look at the numbers. What is Israel fighting for? What is Ukraine fighting for? Israel's gross domestic product last year was $565 billion. Ukraine's gross domestic product last year, of course, was listed as $191 billion. But we all know it's about 150 to 160. Because about $40 to $50 billion in aid comes in every year. This money came for the war and is mostly spent in Ukraine, but it isn't included in the gross domestic product. But even with these numbers, you can see that Israel's economy is 3 times larger in absolute terms, even though Israel's population is 9.5 million people. Now, if we're talking about the standard of living, let's move on to a more indicative criterion, gross domestic product per capita. I'll briefly explain how it's calculated for those unfamiliar with it. It's simply the gross domestic product divided by the population of Ukraine for the past year. Gross domestic product per capita. Israel last year had $54,191, which is almost 11 times more. For comparison, in the United States, it's $85,784. So that's what we should strive for. And when you start drawing any parallels between Ukraine and Israel, you need to start with the numbers. You need to start with the numbers first. Now, recently Israel launched a military operation against Iran. We've already discussed this with you more than once. Let me read Israel's aircraft list. So the F-35 Adir, I may mispronounce it or stress the wrong syllable, but that's not important. Stealth fighters, 45 units, F-15. Eagle, air superiority. 66 units, F-15, Ram, Strike, 25 units, F-16, Barak, multi-role, about 113 units, F-16, Sufa, multi-role, 73 units. So, as you can see, that's almost 300 aircraft that were involved and are currently involved in this military operation against the regime in Iran. These aircraft were built and purchased, correlating with the country's gross domestic product. That's why this ideology of throwing, infantry, I don't even want to use the word meat against the enemy. And militarizing society is an approach that will always lead to a war that will eventually be lost and end in disaster. Today we are standing on the brink of something bad. I suggest starting with the economy. And if the economy is strong, then there will be F-16s, F-35s, and a professional army that needs to be paid for. That's how everything will work. Meanwhile, as everything is stolen, they suggest sending girls to the front and training kindergarten children. Israel's opponents, Iran's proxies, do exactly this, starting in childhood in Iran. Children, boys, are pumped full of militarism. And look at what this has led to in these countries. Israel is seen as a military nation, but children aren't raised on war. Instead, they're taught love for their country, which is very different. Love and hate are not the same. Now let's move on to what for and why. That's really a historical question. Why are Israeli citizens like that? but it's different in Ukraine. Let's look at press freedoms in Israel during wartime and compare them to what's happening in Ukraine. Bloggers and journalists' YouTube channels in Israel operate freely. They also criticize the government, the army, and religious parties regarding wartime restrictions in more detail. Israel Defense Forces censorship. Israel has military censorship that operates during wartime. The media are required to coordinate publications concerning, attention here, troop movements, locations of strikes, casualty numbers before official announcements, and strategic sites. Censorship mainly targets major media, but can also impact Telegram channels and bloggers, especially when citing military sources or sharing real-time attack footage. That is, simply everything related to the war. This is quite understandable, and it does not infringe on any citizen's rights at all. Everything is clear here, and there is nothing anti-democratic about it. Ukraine has total censorship and no freedom of speech. Moreover, people who try to say anything will be immediately repressed. Criminal liability applies for disclosing military secrets or aiding the enemy with information, including possible imprisonment. Understood. Deliberately spreading panic, fake news, or anti-government propaganda can lead to a case. Algorithmic blocking and reports on social networks. Some materials are blocked not by the government, but at the initiative of the platforms themselves if they violate security policies or spread information bypassing official channels. What is allowed? Criticism of Netanyahu's government policy. Criticism of the army. Yes, exposing leaks. Investigations within the law. Yes, blogging, interviews, reporting. No problem, as long as there are no leaks from the Israel Defense Forces. Live broadcasts from rocket impact sites are not allowed if they happen before the censor's permission. We now see that Telegram channels publish arrivals immediately after they occur. I haven't heard of anyone being arrested or detained for that. So, when you talk about sending everyone, even children, to war, you first need to ask, what are we fighting for? We need to decide now. Civilian medical institutions are already contacting us. Information about the health status of men will be transmitted automatically. This automatically violates the constitutional rule on medical confidentiality. I'll stay silent about banking secrecy since it hasn't existed here for a while. But why is everything this way? Think about it, people. There were basically 8 years to prepare for what happened, for Putin's attack, including for the boss, General Krivonos, whom he worked for under the previous government. Why wasn't a professional army created? The current government knew about the attack, but nothing was done for 6 months. Nothing was prepared. But they quickly closed the borders, quickly launched the television marathon, and quickly imposed censorship. And what did this lead to? We can all see it today. Why am I making this video? Because you need to understand, when you go out and say such things in public, there is a certain background behind it. First the money, then the chairs, but not the other way around. First, you need to build a state, a completely different philosophy, to give people freedoms they are willing to go and die for. But I'm speaking in general terms now. I won't go back to the current stage of the war right now. Everything is clear here. It needs to end, and no advice or anything else will help. The war needs to be ended as soon as possible. But why pump people up with this when the country is falling apart at the seams? If you open the borders tomorrow, millions of people will leave. That's a big question, and when people in power hear this, it's all clear. They do propaganda at work, but when those who call themselves opposition come out and in fact reinforce and strengthen the propaganda. And these silly comparisons between Ukraine and Israel, I honestly don't understand why this is being done. But overall, everything is clear here. Israel has a full democracy while Ukraine is a dictatorship. It's all simple, very simple. I just read to you what's allowed. Basically, everything is fully permitted. Military censorship isn't that critical. It's normal in wartime for military matters, casualties, and some strikes, as I said, so there's no issue. I'm talking about politics. The political process is suppressed politically, any alternative point of view, and you're immediately called a Kremlin agent, a traitor, everything imaginable. This is fully underway in Israel. That's why we need to think about success, at least about such numbers in the economy, and only then talk about the militarization of children, which won't even be necessary once we reach those numbers. But that's a completely different story. Just think. Just keep in mind the main thing. When you're offered two options that make you argue and fight with each other, but both options are wrong. There's also a third way, which is actually forbidden to talk about because of censorship. But if you want the truth, please subscribe to my channel and leave your comment about everything you've heard. Bye.